Welcome to the Great Texts Hour. Hello class, and welcome to our ongoing discussion on Vergil's Aeneid. We are moving now to Book 4 and to the famous and tragic love story between Dido and Aeneas. This is one of the great love stories of all Western literature. Not a happy love story, but a love story nonetheless. And in many respects, the first of its kind. We don't see this kind of love and passion in Homer. There is something unique about this torrid affair between Dido and Aeneas. It's celebrated throughout Western history. You can look up English operas, great paintings, all portraying the love between Dido and Aeneas. So what's going on with this love story, and what is Vergil trying to teach us through this love story? The details are very interesting. First of all, remember that Dido is a widow. Her husband has died a violent death. She's actually had to leave the Phoenicians, where she and her people are from, in order to found this new city, this new regime in Carthage. And unlike the old Phoenician city with its blood feuds and its sort of old-fashioned ways, this city is going to be different. This city is going to be enlightened. And Dido is going to be an enlightened monarch who rules kindly and with a somewhat sort of forward-looking air. And she doesn't want to get married again. She just wants to be a good ruler. But then Aeneas comes into her life. And we don't know if it's all her fault or the manipulation of the gods. After all, Cupid disguises himself as Aeneas' son and sits on her lap and somehow bewitches her. So is it her fault? Is it the gods' fault? I can only tell you that there's a famous line from later in the Aeneid where two characters are talking and one of them says, "Are the gods responsible for our passions, or do we make our passions our gods?" What is Vergil trying to do when he portrays the role of the gods in human affairs? Is he really saying we're just helpless pawns? Or is this a metaphor for our own enslavement to our own desires? One thing is certain, Dido is out of her element. She's in way too deep, and she doesn't realize it. Part of it is she lacks the pietas that Aeneas has. Like I said before, she's not an atheist, she's not irreligious, but she's not terribly devout. At least that's the impression I get from reading this account. And so she's kind of new to really taking religion seriously. And when she does, it doesn't go well. So look at the opening lines of Book 4. After Aeneas has shared his story of woe, how he had been driven from Troy, how he had all these terrible misadventures while traveling, and how he finally washed up on the shores of Carthage. When he finishes that story, she's hooked. Too late. The queen is caught between love's pain and press. She feeds the wound within her veins. She is eaten by a secret flame. And she confides to her sister Anna and describes how handsome she finds Aeneas, how strong his chest and arms. I, I think he is born of the gods. Were I not weary, she goes on to say, were I not weary of the couch and torch? Those are references to marriage, the marriage bed, but also the torch. The Hymen's torch was a familiar wedding symbol. Were I not weary of the couch and torch, I might perhaps give way to this one fault. This one fault. The fault meaning her growing love for Aeneas. So she says, nope, I'm going to be a good political ruler. I'm going to remain a widow. I'm going to keep my eyes on the prize, think of my people first. If I have one fault, it's that I like Aeneas. That word there for fault, incidentally, is culpa. And we're going to see that word again. So then she goes on to say on the next page, she goes on to give an oath. This is page 80 in our translation, starting around the line 26, 27. But I should call upon the earth to gape and close above me, or on the Almighty Father to take his thunderbolt to hurl me down into the shades, the pallid shadows and deepest night of Erebus, before I'd violate you, shame, or break your laws. So notice she gives a promise. I will not violate shame. I will not break the laws of shame. And the word there for shame is pudor. It's a very specific kind of shame. It's sexual shame. It is the shame that is unique to sexual embarrassment. Several languages, especially Romance languages, have such a word. We don't in English, but pudeur in French is derived from the Latin pudor, and I believe there's a similar word in Spanish and Italian. So she's saying, I'm not going to violate pudor. And if I do, let these bad things happen to me. Note the bad things. Note the details. Let earth gape and close above me. Let the Almighty Father take his thunderbolt and hurl me down to the shades. Okay? Remember those details. So she makes this oath to the gods. It's a pretty severe oath. She kind of sounds like someone who hasn't taken a lot of oaths. If she had taken a lot of oaths, she'd realized you got to be careful with these sorts of things. Be careful what you promise. So then Anna replies and basically says, go for it. Marry Aeneas. At the very least, you'll have another army. You're young, you're beautiful. Go for it. And she says, okay. And then notice what happens on the very next page when Anna finishes her speech. These words of Anna fed the fire in Dido. Hope burned away her doubt, destroyed her shame. There goes her pudor. And what did she say? She said, I will never destroy the pudor. I will never violate shame. And then she hears Anna say, go for it, and immediately she violates shame, which means she has called the oath upon her, the curse that she has given herself. And so the question is this curse ever fulfilled? Well, look at the details on page 85, or rather 84, around line 215. Aeneas and Dido are gallivanting about in the woods. Notice Carthage. Carthage is not being built anymore. She has fallen in love with Aeneas, and so this has led to political neglect. The Carthaginians are slacking off because she's slacking off. And so they're out in the woods, and then there's a storm, and so they run into a cave. Very romantic, very suggestive. And it's in that cave that she is convinced that they were lawfully married. This is one of those sort of controversial aspects of the Aeneid. Were they actually married? She thinks they are, so she thinks it's all honorable. She doesn't think of the two of them as cavorting about, fornicating. Aeneas, not so sure. But note the details. Dido and the Trojan chieftain have reached the same cave. Primal Earth and Juno, the queen of marriages, together now give the signal. Lightning fires flash. The upper air is witness to their mating, and from the highest hilltops shout the nymphs. That day was her first day of death and ruin. For neither how things seem nor how they are deemed moves Dido now, and she no longer thinks of furtive love, for Dido calls it marriage, and with this name covers up her fault, her culpa. There is that word again. But notice the details. They're in a cave. And what is a cave? A cave is the earth opening and gaping around you. Remember the details of the oath? Let earth open and close around me. Well, now Juno and primal earth have them in a cave. And what happens? Lightning fires flash, just like Jove's thunderbolts mentioned in the oath. And that was her first day of death and ruin. She's eventually going to be sent to the shades by her own hand, for she commits suicide. She has lost all political credibility after she is seen cavorting around with Aeneas. Rumor flies that she is a disgraced woman, and they lose all respect for her. She cannot rule. And so she does a violent and extreme act, commits suicide. And from that moment forward, progressive, kind of secular Carthage grows dark with furor. And eventually, the idea is they will embrace a much darker god. They will become the maniacs, the sort of satanic maniacs that the Romans came to know. And it's all because of this failed political experiment. It's a very interesting political commentary, is it not? Vergil basically seems to be saying that you cannot have a secular society, that society, the glue that holds society together needs to be some kind of religion, some kind of fear of the gods. And if you don't have that, then much darker gods, so to speak, will infect your secular society. It is a very interesting thing to think about. Think of our own day and age. We have a largely secular society. Are there any dark gods in our society that we are worshiping? Maybe not in a sort of a literal way, but you can think of the murder of the unborn. You can think of the slaughter of the innocent and wonder, have we not followed Carthage's infanticidal footsteps? So what about Aeneas? How come he doesn't have the same tragic ending as poor Dido? Aeneas is grounded by pietas. It is an old-fashioned religion. It is an old-fashioned sense of loyalty and duty that gives him a certain kind of restraint. Dido succumbs to her passions, completely succumbs. Aeneas succumbs as well, but as soon as Mercury comes and reminds him of his duty, He snaps right out of it and is back in action. He uses his duty, his sense of duty, to overcome his love of Dido, as strong as that love is. Now that doesn't mean, though, that Aeneas is this loveless character. We shouldn't necessarily think of it as duty versus love, because pietas is a kind of love as well. It is a love of one's homeland, a love of the ancestral, a love of a certain grounded way of life, a love of having roots. And it is that love that he is called to uphold when he must break his love with Dido. It's sad because it also means he's probably never going to be happy, or in the popular sense of that term. Dido was a woman he was truly in love with, and now he has to say goodbye to her. So this is a very tragic love story. Vergil is responsible for the phrase, it's not in the Aeneid, it's in another one of his epics. He's responsible for the phrase, amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. And you see that inscription on bracelets and all over sort of love literature, Hallmark cards, that kind of thing. Love conquers all. And of course, when our ears hear that word, that phrase, we think, oh, it's wonderful. Love conquers all. It overcomes all adversity. It overcomes all prejudice. Love conquers all. It wins over everything. The funny thing is, Vergil did not mean that as a good thing. When Vergil says love conquers all, he says, yeah, it conquers pudor. It conquers all sense of decency. It conquers all sense of self-restraint. It conquers all reason. Dido is delusional. Dido grows insane because of love. Love conquered her sanity. Love conquered Carthage and ruined it. These passions are dangerous, which is why they need to be held firm by the strong hand of something like pietas. We move now to Book 5 of the Aeneid, which in many ways is sort of a puzzling book. It doesn't really seem to advance the plot that much. It is a series of games, funeral games, held in honor of the memory of Anchises, who had passed away a year ago on the island of Sicily. And so we're celebrating these games, but what does this really do for the story as a whole? Why is Vergil putting this in here? Well, there are a couple of reasons. An obvious one is there are similar scenes in Homer's Iliad. So Vergil is saying, yeah, Homer, you can do this, I can do this too. I can do it just as well. But it's more than just a kind of one-upsmanship. When Aeneas calls the games, he says we want to hold these games today in joyful honor. That's the phrase he uses. And I put a question mark by that phrase because it's not actually very easy to balance joy and honor. Honor is one of those unshareable goods. And when you get it, when you get the honor, then sure, you're joyful. But what about all the other people you competed with for that unshareable good who didn't get that honor? Are they going to be happy as well? Chances are they are not. They're going to be rather upset. So it's a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, Aeneas wants his soldiers, his people, to be committed to honor. On the other hand, honor can cause bad feelings because the pursuit of honor can end badly for some people and engender resentment and all kinds of problem and strife. And he needs a unified people, not a people divided against each other. So it's tricky. You want to keep honor, but you also want to make it as joyful as possible. So one way to look at Book 5 of the Aeneid is, how does Aeneas as a leader, what kind of leader is he? How does he as a leader try to balance joy and honor? How does he try to soften the rough edges of the competition over honor? And I think we see him react several different ways. Number one, he is extremely generous to the losers. He gives the guy who gets first prize, he gives him a very generous reward, but he's also giving very generous consolation prizes to the guys who finish second or third. And you see this early on with the ship race. A couple of nail-biting moments. The one you didn't expect to win wins, but he honors those who didn't finish first. And that kind of softens the blow of not having won first prize. Interestingly enough, he also kind of turns a blind eye to certain forms of cheating, or at least less than sportsmanlike behavior. And I am referring to the foot race. There are two very close friends, Nisus and Euryalus, we're going to see them again too, who are running, and one of them falls, and his buddy sees that he has fallen and keeps on going. But the guy who's fallen knows that he can't win, and so to make sure that his buddy wins, he trips a third runner. Now, I don't know if there are official rules against cheating, but everyone who reads that realizes, that's not good. So the guy who got tripped finally finishes, though late, and Aeneas is awarding the prizes. He doesn't dispute the results of the race. And he turns to the guy who got tripped and he says, "Oh, tough luck that," and gives him a very generous consolation prize. It wasn't luck, it was cheating, it was dishonesty, it was unsportsmanlike behavior. It's interesting that he kind of turns a blind eye. And is that a bad thing? I mean, to us today it would be, but what's better? Just sort of letting these little infelicities be put under the rug? Or making a huge federal case about it, having a big commission investigate who tripped whom. If the point is unity, if the point is to overcome bad feelings, making a federal case out of it may engender bad feelings. It may deepen the wound rather than heal it. I'm not saying Aeneas is making the right decision there, but I do think he's trying to find a way of just having us all get along. Another way that he tries to balance joy and honor is by preventing the games from getting out of hand. He intervenes in the boxing match. He stops the aged fighter Anchises from literally beating the brains out of Dares. Dares is this young whippersnapper. He kind of sounds like the guy on the island of the Phaeacians, who challenges Odysseus. "What's the matter, old man? You don't have it in you anymore?" And of course, Odysseus gets furious, and so does Anchises. He pulls out his boxing gloves. This is not modern boxing, this is ancient boxing. In ancient boxing, they had gloves, but the gloves were leather, and they were studded with metal. And Anchises' gloves are caked in blood and brain. This was a very serious, deadly sport. And just when he's about to kill the young upstart, Aeneas intervenes, gives him this beautiful prize bull. And Anchises is still so full of adrenaline, he says, let all see the fate that Aeneas spared Dares from. And he rears back and with one blow crushes the skull of the bull, who goes falling down, twitching. So, boxing can be deadly, but Aeneas says, nope, let's not make it deadly today. He prevents death. And he also encourages non-competitive exercise as well. Competition is good, but there are also team-building exercises that can take place without competition. And there is a chariot parade, not a race, a chariot parade that his son Iulus or Ascanius leads. So all of these are ways of sort of balancing joy and honor. There's also something that is conspicuous for its absence. There is one funeral game that the Romans are very famous for having that is not there. It's a game that you're all familiar with. It's the gladiator games. Gladiator games started out as funeral games. They were forms of entertainment that could originally only be held on the funeral of a notable Roman. But the appetite for these games got so great that under the age of the Caesars, and Julius Caesar I think was the first one who did this, he changed the rules from having to wait for some notable Roman to die so you could have the gladiator games to rather having it on the anniversary of some notable Roman's death. And when he changed that rule, he snipped the cord basically between the games and actual funerals, and then it became just this huge blood sport, and the Roman citizens just drank it in. But what is the gladiator games? It is slaves killing each other. And it's interesting that Vergil is very much aware of this. It's a very popular form of entertainment in his own day and age. And it is not here. What does that tell you about Vergil's attitude towards the gladiator games? Is his silence not a way of criticizing the Romans of his day? Does he not point to the great Aeneas, father of the Roman people, or grandfather of the Roman people, and say, look, Aeneas didn't do this kind of stuff. Aeneas had other ways of entertaining and exercising. Perhaps there is something not just about the gladiator games. We turn now to Book 6 of the Aeneid, one of the most amazing books in all of literature. What is going on in this book is insanely intense and very subtle. But before we get there, remember two things. Remember that Vergil is in the wake of Homer, and he's also in the wake of Socrates. So Homer includes a passage where one of his heroes journeys to the underworld, and we read it in the Odyssey. But if you recall, the Homeric underworld was not terribly well defined. It was just kind of this amorphous place where ghouls kind of floated around. There wasn't a lot of geographical detail to Homer's underworld. But here, oh my goodness, there is tremendous detail in Vergil's underworld. There's the river Styx, there's this deep pit, there's these different fields, there are these different entrances. Why? Well, it may have something to do with the second thing or person that Vergil is living in the wake of, and that is Socrates. Remember, one of Socrates' critiques of Homer was that he portrayed the afterlife in an unsatisfying manner. He did not portray the afterlife in such a way that would incentivize virtuous living. He did not portray it as a place where the good are rewarded and the evil are punished. Notice that Vergil is supplying the deficiencies of Homer by providing a Homeric underworld, but without that Homeric lesson. It's been transformed with a more philosophical lesson about the importance of virtue and the importance of reason over the passions. Think about the details of the underworld and the things that Aeneas either sees or hears. And I'm going to go on the sort of ascending scale. First, he doesn't see, but he hears cries coming from this deep pit called Tartarus. It is a place where the evil are punished. What kind of evil? Crimes against pietas, crimes of treachery, crimes of insurrection, crimes of disloyalty. Notice that this must have hit a Roman in a very special way, because they've just survived the civil wars where there are all these acts of treachery and betrayal taking place. Crimes against pietas are in Tartarus. And did you notice the way Tartarus was described? Vergil says it is twice as deep as Olympus is high. Now, who's the great poet of Mount Olympus? Who's the one who tells you what the gods are talking about on Mount Olympus? It is, of course, Homer. So, one way to interpret that seemingly insignificant detail is Vergil is saying, Homer gave you Olympus and it got you this much, but my poetry, like for example my Tartarus, is twice as deep as Homer's. My poetry has twice as much going on as Homer's, possibly. Aeneas does get to visit 3 places himself. He first visits the mourning fields, where there congregate those who have been killed by love. And there he meets Dido. And it's heartbreaking. He tries to explain to her, why he had to leave her. And notice she is still tragically locked in this love. She cannot deal with it. She cannot forgive him. She does run back weeping to her first husband, who is also dead. Remember, he was murdered. The dead do not learn. They are locked in their imperfections. They are locked in their choices. Their character has sealed them forever. He then goes on to the field of warriors. And these are soldiers who were slain on the battlefield. And of course, it's very funny. Vergil portrays Aeneas walking through this field, and the Greek soldiers see him, even though they're dead, and they flee in fear. Which is funny because the Greeks won the war, right? And yet they're terrified of the Trojans. This is a very common rhetorical stance among nations that have lost to another nation. Think of the Civil War in the United States as an interesting example of this. The Confederate Army lost to the Union, and yet in the South, for a very long time, and even into this very day, there is the assumption that, of course, the Yankees may have won, but they were cowards. They didn't have the bravery, the nobility, the integrity, the courage of a Southern man, right? So we may have lost, but they're still cowards. And that's the exact same play that's being made right here. Troy may have lost, but the Greeks are cowards. But finally, Aeneas makes it to the Elysian fields, or Elysium, where he sees his father Anchises. And this is a very interesting place. It is a place of perfect calm, perfect serenity from a complete absence of passions. And in this perfect state of serenity, Anchises can look at the whole of Roman history in this meadow below him, because he sees the pre-born heroes of what will be future Rome. Because this afterlife is kind of a system of reincarnation. These souls are in the afterlife and they're going to go up and become incarnate and live these particular lives. Does that sound familiar, by the way? An afterlife where the good are rewarded, the evil are punished, and where there's a system of reincarnation. Doesn't this sound a lot like the myth of in Plato's Republic? And remember, Socrates gave the myth of as an example of how a philosopher could do poetry. Very interesting. We'll devote a separate segment to Anchises' speech in the Elysian Fields in just a moment. But before we turn to that, I did want to point out to you these three realms which Aeneas sees with his own eye. Those killed by love, those who died on the battlefield. So in other words, they died fighting, exercising their virtue of courage. And then those who, for lack of a better word, are wise, like Anchises. Their reason is unclouded by passion, and they can see the whole of history. What do those three things remind you of? Appetite, thumos, reason. These are the three parts of the soul. Vergil indeed is benefiting from philosophy. He is entering into this dialectic between philosophy and poetry, and he is coming up with a poetry that has some philosophical richness to it. So Aeneas asks Anchises about this whole reincarnation process and asks, what's the point? And this becomes the inciting incident for a tremendously important speech that Anchises gives. It basically is a blueprint of reality. It has this tremendous metaphysical value. But in the spirit of Plato, just as there can be a similarity between the city and the soul, Anchises' metaphysical speech also has important political implications as well. But let's start with the metaphysical. Anchises describes a universe in which mind rules over matter. So again, think Plato, think the sensible and the intelligible. And the intelligible reality is higher, and it is informing, literally, sensible reality. Mind or spirit, mind or spirit is to rule over the passions and the body. The problem, though, is that the passions are unruly. Our three parts of our soul are disordered, in large part because of our bodily attachments to things. And so there must be some kind of purgation, and this is what that system of metempsychosis is all about in the Aeneid. In other words, reincarnation. It is ultimately to purge people of all of their bad passions, so that in the end, there will be what we see in the Elysian Fields. All reason, no passion. No passion to interrupt the calm exercise of reason seeing the whole. So that is the metaphysics of Anchises. But notice also they have political implications. Just as you could have mind or spirit over the various passions or over the body, you could have one universal government over the nations. In other words, imperial Rome. Remember? Imperium sine fine, empire without end. The gods have given the world to Rome. And not so that the Romans can just dominate and oppress people. There is a purpose to this universal governance. It is to bring the rule of law to all the nations of the earth. If the Romans could boast of one thing, it was the rule of law. This is a notion that is still very important, or at least should be important, in Western civilization. The Greeks gave many, many great gifts to the world, but the one great gift of the Romans was this notion of the rule of law. We conquer you, you become part of our dominion, but we all will follow the law. And this will be for the sake of justice. The rule of law will order all the unruly elements that are responsible for war and destruction and violence in our world. And the result of the rule of law being applied justly to all peoples of the earth will be peace. There'll be no more wars. You can't have wars if you don't have nations. If you have one empire that is not tyrannical but is following a rule of law, you'll have harmony. So you can see how these two visions, the metaphysical and the political, map onto each other nicely. This gives the justification for the Roman Empire. And there is a very famous quote, perhaps the most famous of all in the Aeneid. Anchises is speaking to his son, Aeneas, and it's almost as if he sort of goes into a trance and instead addresses his son Roman, because he's seeing the future. There aren't any Romans yet. We're generations away from that, but he's already thinking in terms of the future. And so notice what he says. This is the bottom of page 158, around after line 1130. For other people's will, I do not doubt, still cast their bronze to breathe with softer features, or draw out of the marble living lines, plead causes better, trace the ways of heaven with wands, and tell the rising constellations. But yours will be the rulership of nations. Remember, Roman, these will be your arts, to teach the ways of peace to those you conquer, to spare defeated peoples, to tame the proud. Notice the Roman conquest of the world has a noble purpose: to teach the ways of peace, to spare the defeated, to tame the proud. This is not just some kind of rapacious piracy. This will be something for the good. Before we continue on that theme, though, go back to the earlier thing. For other people's will, I do not doubt, excel in these other areas. Who do you think the other peoples are? People who are better than the Romans at casting their bronze to breathe with softer features or drawing out of the marble living lines. In other words, art, statue making, sculpting. Others will be better at pleading causes, rhetoric, oratory. Others will be better at tracing the ways of heaven with wands and telling the rising constellations, astronomy. Who was better than the Romans in all these things? The Greeks. So there's that inferiority complex again. And Anchises is saying, yeah, the Greeks can be better in art and oratory and all this other stuff. Although, did you notice there's one thing he doesn't mention? There's no mention of epic poetry. The Greeks will not be better than the Romans in epic poetry, apparently. Why not? Possibly because they have Vergil. Vergil, I don't think, was ever accused of being overly modest. So, aside from epic poetry, what will be the great thing that the Romans will be famous for? The rulership of nations. Romans will know how to govern. And this governance, again, is not for their own selfish purpose. It's the gods are allowing it to providentially bring peace on earth. This is the famous Pax Romana, the famous Roman peace. So you can see why a lot of people think of Vergil as little more than Roman propaganda. This clearly is a justification of empire. The question is, does he believe it? Does he believe his own propaganda? There is one very interesting detail at the end of Book 6 that may shed light on this question. Did you notice that Aeneas does not exit the underworld the same way he came in? He has to take a different exit. And he's given two different options, or told there are two different options. The first is a gate of horn, an entrance made out of horn, and the other is a gate of ivory from which false dreams enter into the upper world. Curious details. And Aeneas goes out through the gate of ivory. He goes out through the gate of false dreams. Think about what that means. If he's going out, Aeneas, this hero, through the gate of false dreams, does it not mean he's a false dream? Does this not mean that Vergil is acknowledging that this is a noble lie? It's all a lie. The gods haven't made these promises to Rome. There is no divine providence governing all this stuff. So why would Vergil give us this noble lie? Because it is noble. This lie will ennoble the Romans who believe it. This lie will give them a sense of restraint, a respect for the rule of law. It will give them a sense of pietas, so that they won't go running amok, so that something good may come from this empire which has emerged from these destructive civil wars. This is, Book 6 is the myth of adapted by Vergil for the Roman people. And it is a noble lie. It is a false dream. And it's coming out of the gate of ivory. Where is the gate of ivory on your body? What is ivory? It's teeth, is it not? So if you were to speak poetically, what is your gate of ivory? It is your mouth. So picture Vergil the poet proclaiming the story of Aeneas, but it is a false dream. A noble one, though, one that if the Romans believe, will make them a better people.